Grace and peace, everybody. Welcome.
Grace and peace.
Thank you, Kyle. All right. So how's everybody doing tonight? Fantastic. Good. Glad to hear it. So last week, we heard firsthand from Peter. Remember I brought him in here? About the ways that we are to live our lives in relationship to the authority that God had put into place. And we heard how that using Christ's actions as our examples, we should submit to that authority and to the government of the time because God put it into place. And we learned that we should live our lives in such a way that our light then shines so that the world can see it and see that there is a difference in the way that we live our lives and the world lives their lives. Now we're in chapter 3 of Peter, and Peter continues in the same theme by talking about the way that we should live our relationships with each other.
You see, in the world of Rome, women were little more than just property. They had no rights under Roman law, and they remained forever children. When a woman lived with her father, she was under her father's rule, and he had the rights to her life and her death. When she married, that ownership passed on to her husband. If you caught your wife in the act of infidelity, she could be killed without trial. Roman women were forbidden to drink wine and could be beaten if they were caught. Women could be divorced for appearing in public without a veil, and they were not allowed to participate in any public games or speaking to women who were free in the public. They weren't able to make decisions themselves, so therefore they couldn't vote or serve in the Senate. Even with regards to their spirituality or their religion, whoever the master of the house believed in, that is who the entire household observed. So for example, if your husband believed in Mithra, who was a famous god of that time, then your entire household was followers of Mithra also.
So then Jesus enters the picture. And he has women of all different kinds of background who are close to him. There's even some suggesting by scholars that they were funding his ministry. And this creates a situation that both Peter and Paul feel compelled to address. And what we have here is the address to both wives and husband that basically tells us, like our approach to authority, that our lives should reflect a life that will bring people closer by the light, not by words, but by our actions. Sorry, that's mine, right? This is interesting. So anyways, I have this pastor friend of mine, and he once told this story. He said there was a time when a friend asked him if he would marry him and his fiancée. Now, the couple had met on the internet, and he had agreed to quit his job and move to Texas if she agreed to do their premarital counseling and have my friends officiate their wedding for them. So it was kind of strange to begin with. So during the early counseling sessions, my friend was discussing serving each other in marriage. And this friend of his blurted out, "I don't think I can do this." Well, as you can imagine, my friend was a little bit shocked and taken aback. And he asked the man, "Why? Why can't you do this?" And to which the man replied, "Mountain biking." Now, this is not, of course, the answer that my friend was expecting. But seeing the earnestness in the man's face, he asked the man to explain.
So then the man explained that he just loved mountain biking, and he was terrified that if he got married, his wife wasn't going to let him purchase any mountain biking gear or let him go on any mountain biking trips that he loved to do previously. My friend told me that the word came to his mind at that moment was submit. Not her submitting to him or him submitting to her. He didn't even know if he could submit at all, because let's face it, submitting is some serious stuff. Submitting is difficult, but it's the only hope that a marriage has.
Now, I know, especially with you fellas, that some of you are out there squirming in your seats over the word submit. Miss Dottie, how you doing over there? Can I get an amen, Miss Dottie? All right. That word has been the root of a lot of abuse in relationships for both men and women. But as Christians, we can't ignore the fact that Peter uses it in today's passage, and that Paul uses it in Ephesians chapter 5. And if we reject it, we miss out on the good of it, the worth of it, and the truth in it. You see, the word submit comes from the Greek, word hapatasso. And it actually is a combination of two words stuck together. The word upo, which means under, and the word tasso, which means to translated to place in order. So submit means to place yourself under or to give allegiance to, or to tend to the needs of. So scholars feel that this might have been at one point a military word in the sense that soldiers put themselves under their commanding officer. So if we think about this, our passage is saying that we should place ourselves under each other because both male and female are told to submit out of reverence for Christ, so that the world might see us in a new light. Jesus calls us to follow his example in the book of John. In John, he writes, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." At the heart of what it means to be a Christian is the idea that people are worth dying for.
I've never been to Ground Zero, but it comes to my understanding that several blocks surrounding that area, there are several homemade memorials that were made for officers and firefighters who gave their life that day for the people who passed away. Why do the flowers and the plaques and the memorials mean so much to us? It's because at the heart of the heart, we know that the truth is that people are worth dying for, and it's almost completely overwhelming when people actually do it. Jesus said that there is no greater love a person can show for another than to lay down their lives for another. People are worth dying for. What greater example do we have in Jesus' death? He thought we were worth dying for.
So the message is beginning here in 1 Peter 3 is the same that he finished in chapter 2. Love and serve those around you and place their needs ahead of your own, out of respect and out of reverence for what Jesus did for our lives. Excuse me. Our lives are to reflect the self-giving sacrifice that he made in the ultimate act of love in his sacrifice, or to die to yourself so that others can live, kind of like Jesus did. But it's not just Peter who says this. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes to the church, writes to a church. And here we have to understand that the you there is plural, meaning that he is writing to a group of people. And in this passage, he is writing once again that as a church, they must live in such a way that when people observe their lives together, they will see what Jesus was like. Our lives are to be a mirror of what Jesus was like. Did you get that? Because see, in verse 22, there's something very interesting that happens here, and I have it highlighted on the screen. In the Greek, the original way that this was written, it actually reads, "Wives, to your husband as to the Lord." Did you notice anything? Is there something missing there? See, we're missing a verb. And when you're reading in the Greek, when there's a verb missing, that means that you have to go back to the previous line and figure out what the verb was. So to figure that out, we go back to the last line, which was written in plural. So the wives aren't asked to be doing anything different than anybody else, and that's submit. Everybody else is being commanded to do the same thing in verse 21. And that's namely, submit yourselves or place the needs of others in front of your own, especially the needs in the most significant relationship, that of a husband and a wife. And why do we do this? We do this out of reverence for the sacrifice that Christ made for us.
So guys, let's not go thinking that you're getting off that easy. Hear this. Verse 23 reads, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." Then in verse 24, the plural submit command is repeated in verse 25. Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church." We are to live like Christ. Christ is the head of the church. Men, you are to live like Christ. Christ is the head of the church. Christ's headship comes from his sacrifice, his surrender, his willingness to give his life for her, his death. Men, whatever authority we receive from the word heard it carries with the fact that our authority is rooted in the sacrifice of Christ, and therefore our willingness to sacrifice ourselves.
So, let's pull this all together. The husband is commanded to lay down his life for his wife, and the wife is commanded to submit to the husband, but they are both commanded to submit to each other because everyone is commanded to submit to everyone else, and it's all out of reverence for Christ. Notice how Peter words it in verse 1 of our passage tonight. In wives, in the same way. And then in verse 7, he says, husbands, in the same way. When you take this passage and connect it to the chapter before it and take it in context as a whole, Peter wants them to submit their authority to the Roman government, but to do so because of the model Christ gave. And then this passage becomes far less more about who gets to control the remote and more about being like Christ.
The point is being a Christian, living as a Christian in everything we do, and making ourselves even more personal and more Christ-like in our relationships. When people look at us, do they see Christ? When they see our relationships, do they see a submissive love that is willing to die for our mate? To be a part of something like that, I don't think that there's anything more beautiful than to fulfill one's life by fulfilling another's in humble submissiveness. This is the plan that God has wrote out for us. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Amen.